Hi everyone, David Millington here. I'm the C++ project manager at Embarcadero. I'm going to give a talk today on mixing Delphi and C++. So we provide RAD Studio, which contains both Delphi and C++ Builder, and you want to use both of the languages. Well, here's how to do it. So RAD Studio contains two languages, Delphi and C++, and they can of course be used independently. You can buy them independently, and even if you have RAD Studio, which includes both of them, you can use them independently. You can create a Delphi project, or you could create a C++ project. But what's particularly interesting is that they can both be used together in the one project, certainly in the one project group, but also in the one project. And that's very unexpected because they are different languages. And we don't have a runtime like .NET CLR. This is our languages compiled natively, and so we have a strong degree of binary compatibility between two completely different languages. This is very unexpected for many people who are new to the Delphi or C++ Builder ecosystem, and it's very powerful. It lets you get the best of both languages. Delphi, of course, is a beautiful language. It's expressive, it has great reflection, it's great for UIs and data and database access and that kind of thing. C++ has very different idioms, and it's very good for scientific and engineering and math and image processing and that kind of thing. Especially things focused very heavily on performance, more than most other languages. C++, especially modern C++, has a lot of language features that are designed to help the compiler produce very performant code. In fact, a lot of stuff can often be evaluated at compile time. So for the basics, this session won't actually introduce C++ syntax itself. There's a whole other session, this CodeRage, on learning C++ if you are a Delphi programmer. But it's not that hard, despite its reputation. It's just different. It can get quite complex, and it can be a little confusing. But the vast majority of C++ is actually quite straightforward. Once you know how it works, it works very well. So check out the C++ for Delphi Programmers session. There's also a Learn Programming with C++ Builder blog series aimed at those who know how to program but who don't know C++. So it's not Learn Programming with C++ Builder, it's Learn Programming with C++ Builder. Now in RAD Studio we support modern C++. Our level at the moment is C++ 11, and there are different year-named versions of C++ which introduce new features and new items in the standard library. So one interesting thing is that you can't add C++ to a files, C++ code to a Delphi project, but you can add Delphi files to a C++ project. So there are two main ways to mix the two. The first is to create a C++ project and then drag in your Pascal files, and then that's done. When you build your C++ project, it will build all the Pascal files that are in the C++ project as well as the C++ there. One other option, and I recommend this option personally if you have an existing Delphi application and you're interested in adding C++ to take advantage of some C++ features or C++ libraries or something like that. One other option is to make a package. Of course, just like Delphi, you can make a C++ package. And then you keep the C++ bits there. You define an interface in Delphi, but you implement the interface with C++. And I'm actually going to show you this technique. So most of this talk is actually not going to be slides. It's going to be in the IDE itself, and I'm going to demo two things. The first is C++ calling into Delphi code, and then the second is Delphi calling C++ code. So the simplest of these is C++ calling Delphi code, and the reason for that is that C++ Builder can consume Delphi. So when you have a C++ project, it could contain just C++ files, but you can also add Pascal files. And they are compiled first, and the Delphi compiler actually generates headers so that C++ can include the headers and see what it thinks is C++, really. And yes, just it happens when it links that it's linking to something that was generated with Delphi. So I'm going to give a live demo of this. So I have here a C++ project, and you can see that it contains a couple of C++ files. One thing I do want to point out is that in the project options, this isn't required, by the way, but my advice is to turn off Use Classic Ball and Compiler. This lets you use the new Clang-based, the Clang Enhanced compilers, and in Berlin, starting in Seattle actually, we ship those for both Windows 32-bit as well as Windows 64-bit. Now, you don't need that in order to be compatible between Delphi and C++. It's just that doing that allows you to use more modern C++ and you get better optimizations and that kind of thing. So my strong recommendation for any C++ project, especially if you create a new one, is to make sure that you turn off that compiler option so that you are using the new compilers. So I have a C++ project here, and I have a button, and I want to get it to call some Delphi code. So you might notice that I have also added a Pascal file to my C++ project. In fact, you can right-click on a C++ project and add a new, you can see these Delphi items here, forms and units, as well as the C++ forms and units. So a C++ project can consume Delphi just fine. And I've already done that. And so I have Delphi code.pas here. And this is a pretty simple unit. I have an interface here. The reason for including the interface is to show, an interface of course is a Delphi language feature. C++ doesn't have interfaces such, it has pure virtual classes. And in Delphi an interface is reference counted, so you don't need to worry about memory management. And C++ of course you'd use a smart pointer or something instead. So I'm including the interface here quite deliberately in order to show how something like that, something that is a Delphi managed type, happens to work as well in C++. This interface just has a single method, do something, and I have a function here that will create an instance of a class that happens to implement that interface. I've defined that class here. Of course, the nice thing about this is in the implementation sections that it's hidden from the outside world. And of course, when you use interfaces and you have concrete implementations, you should try, depending however you do it, whether it's using another unit or whether you put a type in the implementation or whatever kind of method you choose, you want to hide the concrete implementation, of course, because you don't want code to actually accidentally rely on that rather than relying on the interface. And I just have a normal class here as well, and this normal class has a constructor and it has a property that you can read and write. And that property is a string, which is a Delphi type, another managed Delphi type, and of course property is something that doesn't exist in normal C++ either. So the point of this code is to show Delphi that uses Delphi features. Some of these are the basic things that make the language the language. What does that look like when you try and access this from C++ Builder? So first of all, I'm just going to build this, and what you'll see, this is normally very fast, but I'm going to pause it in the video, is that the compile dialog will compile the Pascal file first before compiling the C++. When it does that, it will generate a header. So just let me do that. Okay, now it's compiling the C++ side. In the video, I paused and lengthened the Pascal bit quite a bit just so you could see what was happening. And so what we have now is that Delphi code.pas will have created a Delphi code.hpp. So let me come back to the form and go to the code. and I can hash include this Delphi code.hpp. So let's have a look at that. It is machine generated, so it doesn't look like something that was created by a person. So you can see at the top, for example, it has a whole bunch of sort of pragmas that you do various things for compatibility. And it creates a namespace, and the namespace is the name of the unit. So all types that were defined in the unit will be inside the namespace. And then you can see a few things here. Ignore the 4 declarations. We have the interface, iMyDelphi interface, and of course that inherits from system interface. A bit of Delphi magic there that interfaces happen to have addref and release because of the way interface reference counting that's baked into the compiler actually works. Here, though, we need to say that we actually support the interface. And it has this pure virtual method to do something. And then down here you have a class, and it inherits from t-object. A couple of macros that expand to some decal specs. In Delphi, of course, you use the inherited keyword to access a class's immediate ancestor, and C++ doesn't have that. You have to specify the type name. Can be a source of bugs as well if you want to inject a new class into an inheritance hierarchy. So the Delphi compiler automatically creates a type def for inherited, which can be quite useful. And you'll see that the ftext field which was a string on the Delphi side, is now a system Unicode string on the C++ side. And we have the property getter here and the property setter, and again that's a system Unicode string. And we have the constructor and the property. Now you're probably noticing a few sort of underscore keywords here. So underscore fast call is the Delphi fast call calling convention, which is what Delphi uses by default. Uses registers quite a lot. And of course C++ doesn't have properties. The concept of a property just doesn't exist. And so our compiler extensions add properties to C++. And because it's an extension, we use an underscore prefix. So underscore property. And then we have this text property with the read and write modifiers. And a few other things. There's the create a Delphi instance method that we defined as well. And then the rest of it is just finishing up the namespace and all the various pragmas. So you can tell that it's definitely machine generated, but you can also see the direct translation of the Delphi into C++ format. So C++ will see this, it will see a header, and it won't really be aware that the actual implementation of that header, when it comes to linking to it at link time, happens to be generated by the Delphi compiler. It's not aware of that at all. The Delphi compiler just generates the header, and when you link your application together, it all just works. So what does this look like? You don't often have to look at the header very often. Of course, you actually want to stick to your C++. So what does this look like when we're now using those methods and interfaces and stuff from C++? So just going to switch back over to Delphi code to remind you what we had. We had an interface, and we had a class, and we had a function that returns an instance of a class implementing that interface. So on the C++ side, let's look at the class first. So I have a std unique pointer. I've spoken quite a lot about unique pointers. There's another session in this CodeRage about using unique pointers. I strongly recommend you look into it. And I'm giving that an instance of a Delphi class. And of course you can see this is C++ syntax. I might perhaps use make unique instead of new, but it's normal C++ syntax. There's nothing here that indicates that you're actually using Delphi. And then there is this property text, and I'm setting that to a string. And again, this is a property. It's not a normal C++ feature, but as you can see from the syntax, there's nothing here indicating that there is anything unusual. It is exposed in a very C++ fashion. So if I scroll down a bit more, let's get to the interface. And this, I think, is a bit more interesting, because Interfaces, of course, on the Delphi side are reference counted. And when we expose Delphi language features to C++, we need to keep that kind of compatibility. So, for example, on the mobile platforms, Delphi has Arc, and that means that Delphi objects in C++ also use Arc. And all this kind of support is baked into the compilers. You don't see it, you don't need to worry about it. Everything just works using the right semantics. So create a Delphi instance returns a instance of that class. And of course, being heap allocated, you want to delete it, but being an interface, it is reference counted and you don't need to worry about it. Just like if you were using a unique pointer. So what's this _di_ thing? Well, let's have a look here in the Delphi code. This is actually a typedef to a special template in the system. And I'm not going to delve into how that's implemented, but that means that the interface is reference counted on the C++ side as well. That actually implements that kind of support. And so _di_ is Delphi interface. You can declare a variable of that type, and it will have the same reference counting semantics as you're used to in Delphi. And for C++ people, that means that just like a shared pointer is probably the closest thing to compare to, just like a shared pointer, the object here that's returned and that's owned here will only be deleted when the last reference to it disappears, when the ref count falls to 0. And this interface defined a method, do something. So first of all, let's run this. If you remember in Delphi code, do something, where are we? Do something to show a message box. So if we run this, we should hopefully be able to click the button and get a message box. So here we are, we have a form, and the form is C++, and this message box here was called from Delphi, which is very cool. So let's perhaps drop in a couple of breakpoints so here we can see what's happening. So we're doing on the C++ side. For example, put a breakpoint in there so that we can call do something. Let's try a property setter, for example, as well. Okay, so call Delphi code, and you can see that even though this is a C++ project, we have the call stack working, and you'll see that it was showing in C++ syntax as well. That is showing the method here in the call stack, and of course things like evaluate, modify, and that kind of thing all work as well. So I can step, of course, and continue. And if I press F9 to run, then of course we'll break here and I can step into. Here you can see the Delphi interface template that is in system. And you can see I'm stepping into the Delphi code. So what you're seeing here is seamless debugging between C++ and Delphi. That includes in the call stack, it means all the symbols, it means stepping and running, and the entire debugging experience is seamlessly integrated despite having two different languages. So I can continue to step, and of course we get the message box, and I will run. So there you go. That's how we call Delphi from C++. It's very simple. You just have your Delphi unit, and then you add it to your C++ project. And a header is automatically created, and you can hash include that, and just use everything as though it was in C++. So that was C++ calling into Delphi. What about the other way? What about Delphi calling into C++ code? Well, that's really quite interesting. So the way that it worked when when C++ was using Delphi was that the Delphi compiler generates a header. And so C++ sees what it thinks is C++. But of course you can't do that the other way around, because C++ can't translate to Pascal. Most Delphi constructs can be expressed in terms of something that C++ can understand, and we do a lot of magic there as well. We have various compiler extensions for a lot of the Delphi features, and we have a lot of sort of magic going on in our toolchain. So C++ can consume all the Delphi types, interfaces and strings and currency and properties and anonymous methods and all that kind of stuff works. But C++ is a very different language to Delphi, and so you can't translate the other way. First of all, not quite sure how it would work. Perhaps you would create a unit that had an interface section only but no implementation, and that would be a bit strange. But the main problem is that there are many things in C++ that don't translate to Pascal. Or if they did, they would come out very, very strange. Pascal is quite an elegant language and has specific concepts and specific ways of doing things, and much of C++ wouldn't translate. So how then do you expose C++ code to Delphi? Well, one interesting thing, and in fact one really useful thing, is that C++ classes can inherit from Delphi classes. This is, of course, because C++ can consume all Delphi types. And if it sees a Delphi class as what it thinks with a header is C++, it can inherit. So you can define a base class in Delphi. There might be an abstract class, but it might have implementation as well. It's just a normal Delphi class. But you can implement a descendant in C++, and you can construct it in C++ and return a pointer to it. But because the class's interface is defined in Delphi, you can call it from Delphi as though it is Delphi. It's cool, really cool. And one common question actually that I've got before when talking about this kind of thing, the question is, in the C++ descendant, do you have to be careful what C++ you use? Can you define methods or member variables using C++ types that Delphi wouldn't understand? And the answer is yes, you can. It doesn't matter how much C++ it uses on the C++ side in the descendant implementation. You can use all the C++ that you want to use, because Delphi won't see anything that it can't understand. It will see the Delphi-defined interface. So I'm going to give a live demo of this. So back over to Rad Studio, and in the project manager here, of course, I had this C++ project to demonstrate calling Delphi. I'm just going to close that. I have two other projects in this project group, and this one is a Delphi project. And I have a form here with a button, and I want clicking that button to call some C++ code. So the use case I'm demonstrating to you here now is what I would recommend you do if you have an existing Delphi project and you want to add C++. How do you do that? Well, this is a Delphi project, and we're going to show you one way of what I think is a really good way to call C++ code. So I have a Delphi-defined abstract class here, and every method in it is virtual abstract. So it's a pure virtual class. And it has a do something method, and it has a property that just gets and sets some text. And this is what Delphi is going to see. And then I have a function to create a C++ descendant. See, the problem here is that if you want to create a C++ descendant of this class, which of course you can do on the C++ side, how do you get the Delphi code to create an instance of that? Because the Delphi code can't see the C++ code in order to see there as a descendant and call t C++ descendant.create, and then you can't do that. So instead we just have a factory method that's going to create the C++ descendant of this class. And so I'm implementing that in a package. And so you can see I declare this function here, create CPP descendant, returns this abstract class, and it is in the package. So let's have a look at the package. Now this is a C++ project, and it happens to have the Delphi abstract class, this unit, added in as well. And the reason for that is that just like the other C++ project, when you build it, it will compile the Pascal first and generate the header. And let's go over to the C++ class here. You can see that I'm including Delphi abstract class.hpp, which is the auto-generated header. And now I'm defining a descendant of that class. So TAbstract class is the one that was in the Delphi unit. And if I open the header, you can see that. That's Control-Enter, by the way. When you put the cursor in a file name, press Control-Enter, it opens. And you can see, again, it's machine generated, but you can see here you have a pure virtual class defined in C++. So let's just close that. So then I'm just using normal C++ syntax to create a descendant class, except for this decal spec here, mentioning that to the compiler, hinting that it has some Delphi in there somewhere. And so then I'm going to implement, of course, all the methods, so the getter and setter for the property. I have the property here using the property keyword, the do something method, then a constructor and destructor. What I want to demonstrate here is using some actual C++, C++ that wouldn't be compatible, that couldn't be expressed with Delphi in this class. So I have a vector, for example. So templates, of course, are something that would be very difficult to translate to Delphi. But here we are, we have a std vector. So let's go to the C++ side. It's pretty trivial implementation. I have a text which just says initialize in C++, and I initialize the vector with a few elements. This is using the unified initialization syntax in C++. And the getter and setter, and then do something. So I'm using a string stream here to create a message flow from C++ class to read the text property. Now text is a Delphi string, and I'm using a C++ wide string stream. So I use the cstr method, which gets a if it was a plain narrow string, it would be a car pointer. Here, when it's a wide string, it's a wcar-t pointer. And you can convert to and from Delphi strings and C++ W strings using cstr very easily. So I have a string stream, and I'm just creating a message flow from C++, what the text property is, and how many items the vector contains. Again, demonstrating using of C++ types and that kind of thing. And then I show a message box. And if you remember, there was the factory method that was supposed to create an instance of a C++ class. So I copied the Delphi prototype here in, and this is what it looks like. On the Delphi side, by the way, you can use any calling convention, but here it's std call, and I'm saying it's exported, and it creates a descendant, and it just creates an instance of the C++ class. So let's run this and see what happens. So just remember, what's going to happen is that we have this Delphi project. Actually, I should show the implementation of this button. So we have the button here, TAbstract class, that's going to be initialized by calling create CPP descendant. It's going to use the property, and then it's called do something, and that do something will show a message box with a value of what text is. So this Delphi project here is going to load the C++ package, and it will load that method create CPP descendant, and then this code that you can see on the screen will actually call into C++. And not only will it call into C++ code, but it will be using a C++ class. It's very good to point out that's what it's doing. I mean, you could just expose a single method, just like you would with a CDLL, but what I'm really trying to show here is the use of an object-oriented thing, a class that is actually implemented in C++, which you're calling from Delphi. And the other thing that I've done is that because I have a package here, I set up the dependencies. So for a particular project, you can select projects that have to be built before this one, and I've told the Delphi project that the C++ package has to be built. That means that when I run and compile this one, I don't have to worry about running and compiling the package. The IDE will look after that for you. So when I run, you can see it's actually compiling the package now, and that's because of the dependency. And now it's compiling the Delphi project. And so I have my Delphi form here. So I'm going to click this to call some C++ code. And here we go. Hello from a C++ class. The text property is set from Delphi, and the vector contains 5 elements. And that is fantastic. And what I will do is show some debugging as well. So remember, this is a Delphi project. I'm going to go over to the C++ here, and I'm going to put a breakpoint inside do something. So let's go back, press the button again, and you can see that the breakpoint is hit inside the C++ code, inside the package that the Delphi project is using. And this is very cool. So I'll step over all of that. Notice as well that the local variables here, for example, is showing str message correctly. The debugger is nicely integrated and works very well. And of course, when I run, you get the message box. So that's showing one way to call into C++ code from Delphi, and not just call into C++ code, but call into C++ class to actually have a class that you interact with from Delphi. I think that is really, really cool. So I showed 2 things. The first was to have a C++ project, and you can add Pascal files to that because C++ can consume Delphi very well. We have a lot of compiler magic going on in our toolchain, and it's quite an unusual thing to have language compatibility, especially between such different languages, without a runtime as well. I mean, don't forget these are unnatively compiled. And the second way I showed was to use a package if you want to isolate C++. That way there's no need to change your existing Delphi projects, and I highly recommend this approach to add C++ to an existing Delphi project. In this sense, you gain all the benefits of both languages. The languages are quite different and are suited for different things and good for different things. C++ has a lot of libraries available for things like engineering and math and science. There's a GitHub link on screen for some of the trending C++ repositories right now. Have a look. It's a language designed for a lot of compile time optimization as well, such as constexpr, which is something that I haven't mentioned before, but C++ will let the compiler try and figure out a lot of stuff at compile time. So it's possible, for example, to have methods where given a particular parameter, it will always have one specific result. And so at compile time, we'll actually figure that out and we'll put the result in the compiled code rather than having the method in there as a method that is actually called at runtime. And some of this, of course, can make the language much harder to read and to understand and to see what it's doing, especially once you get into some heavily templated code, for example. But both languages have different strengths and so C++ sort of trades something like that for complexity and perhaps confusion. But this lets you use the best of both languages, and our integration is really well done. The languages are very closely integrated, as you can see, which is a fantastic thing. And I think for those who are used to natively compiled languages and the level of integration that you get, about often the closest you get are bindings, for example, and lots of, sort of translation layers and that kind of thing. We have everything baked into the compilers. It's fantastic technology. So a couple of links on the screen. The first one is the GitHub trending link that I mentioned before. You can have a look at that just to see some of today's or this month's trending C++ repositories on GitHub. Look up the Delphi ones as well, actually. I think you need to type in Pascal rather than in Delphi. And also a blog link. That's a blog series that I'm writing at the moment. called Learn to Program with C++ Builder. It's not Learn to Program, but Learn to Program with C++ Builder. It assumes that you already know some basic programming, if you know the basics, and then introduces you to C++ and to C++ Builder. So it covers a lot of important C++ concepts and shows a lot of code, and also shows a lot of the stuff that C++ Builder can offer. It's building a small but a real-world application. It's building a useful calculator of the sort that you might find on the iOS App Store, say, as a real-world application, because I find that a lot of blogs or articles tend to have just demo code, as you saw today in the demo that I just gave. And this one actually creates a real and useful application. And it shows a lot of the stuff that C++ Builder brings to the table as well. It uses the FireMonkey UE framework, for example. It's a fantastic UE framework, as you all know, and you have native controls on Windows and iOS, and you have all the effects and the vectorization, and it's an outstanding UE library, and having it available in C++ is amazing as well, because it is better than any of the other C++ UE libraries that are available, including the ones that are meant to be cross-platform. So check out that series if you're interested in learning more about C++. There is also a C++ for Delphi programmers session, this CodeRage, so check that one out. That covers a lot of the C++ syntax if you're a Delphi programmer and you want to get started with C++. Finally, there's our DocWiki, and we have hundreds of C++ samples available there, so check that out. And now let's open it up to Q&A.